Hello, and thank you for joining us today for this webinar led by Andreas Schleicher on the topic of equity in education. Please feel free to send your questions at any time during the presentation to Eric Magnusson. That's eric.magnusson@oecd.org. Thank you.
Thanks for joining, and this is an important day. It's the very first time that at the OECD we have been able to piece together different knowledge and information sources from the earliest years of social development up to the consequences of or later development in adult life, to see how equality and inequality advances and develops in the lives of people. First, as a bit of context, we know that higher income inequality and lower social mobility are often closely connected. Now, if you don't have a lot of resources, you have fewer opportunities to get a good education and so on. And we also know that education can be the key to promoting social mobility, but to the extent to which it does really depends on how we distribute educational opportunities. There's no automaticity that a rising tide is going to lift all boats. The challenge for countries is really moving from equality, where we give every student the same resources, to equity, where we ensure that resources matches the need of students very closely, and last but not least, removing some of the barriers that stand between the success of students and the environment from which they come. One of the things that PISA has shown us over time is that poverty need not be destiny. What I'm going to do on the chart here is to order student learning outcomes by decile of social background. For example, the red dot that you see on the left side here are the learning outcomes in science of the 10% most disadvantaged 15-year-olds in the Dominican Republic who go to school. The green triangle are the 10% students from the wealthiest families. And you can see there's a big gap. So basically, the family context from which you come makes a huge difference for our success in the Dominican Republic. But is that inevitable? One way to study this is to look at students like those in the red dot, which have a certain level of socio-economic context, and see how they perform in different countries. And when you do that, you can see that students from very similar backgrounds can have very different learning outcomes. The country where you go to school has a much greater impact on your success than the country where you come from. For example, you look at the 10% most disadvantaged students in Vietnam or Estonia or in Hong Kong, and they do better than the 10% wealthiest students in much of Latin America. So poverty need not be destiny. That was an important starting point for us to ask ourselves, what drives those differences that you can see here on the chart? And we didn't want to limit ourselves just to performance on PISA, the cognitive outcomes. We've also looked at social and emotional factors, the sense of belonging that students feel at school, their sense of ownership, their growth mindset or self-efficacy, and also how they see their own future, their career expectations. And last but not least, we look at very traditional measures like years of schooling or the completion of school or university. Let's start with the last, the educational attainment. First, you can see across the world, when you look over the last 100 years, that the wealthier countries have seen much more rapid growth in access to education than students in lower or middle income economies. In one way, what you can see here on a global scale is what we can see in the families, in the schools, in the countries, that a wealthier context is an advantage in getting more education. It works in your country, it works in schools, and as you can see, it works on a global scale. But there are lots of exceptions. One of the things that I already mentioned is that a rising tide doesn't automatically lift all boats. Compare Singapore and Italy. What you can see are three lines. The first is, with the triangles, is the likelihood of students getting a good education depending on their parents having a high level of education as well. And you can see in both Singapore and Italy that probability has increased. So basically, when you look over time, over successive generations, you are more likely to get a better education if your parents also had a tertiary education. But what's interesting when you look at Singapore, that for those where neither parents had attained upper secondary education, so neither parent had completed high school, the probability for students to get a good education has risen faster. So Singapore is a good example where rises in access to education have actually reduced the disparities, the social disparities in education. If I compare that with Italy, actually the gap has grown wider. Now, everybody has benefited, but those who come from the wealthier backgrounds, the better educated backgrounds, have benefited more. It's an important point. So in a way, you can say an expansion of education can serve education mobility and by implication social mobility, or it can actually increase disparities. We can summarize that by looking at upward mobility across countries more systematically. The share of the bar that you can see in green is where basically adults have higher levels of educational attainment, better degrees than their parents. And you can see in Cyprus, in the Russian Federation, Singapore, Korea, Finland, and so on, upward mobility is very good. More than half of the adult workforce or population had achieved better than their parents. But you can see other countries like the Czech Republic, Germany, Turkey, and so on, where it's only a small minority. So again, this varies hugely across countries, showing us that actually more progress is possible. What's also interesting, when we look at this over successive cohorts, we can see in many countries, upward mobility was higher among those who are today 56 to 65-year-olds than it is among those who are today 26 to 35-year-olds. In the early phase of rapidly expanding education system, it was easier to move more people upwards, whereas today, where education is already quite well developed, there is always a residual that is harder to move upwards. So something to think about. But there are also other countries where we can see that trend actually going into the right direction. Korea, for example, being a very good example, where you can see mobility is actually very, very high, even in the young population. So this gives you a sense of how this has changed over time. Let's move on from educational attainment, years of completion, the kind of quantity of education, to the quality of education, cognitive achievement. And what you can see here is that the average difference in science scores between disadvantaged and top-performing students is very, very large in many countries. Basically, the blue dot shows you the students who do best in a country, and the yellow dot shows you the performance of students from the quarter or bottom quarter on the socio-economic scale that we have here. You can see in virtually every country, the gap is very, very large, sometimes the equivalent of many school years. But what's also interesting, that disadvantaged students perform very differently across countries. Where they go to school really matters a lot. What's also interesting is that those things are not written in stone. You have some countries on the right side where you can see between 2000, 2009 and 2015, things have improved. There is now greater equity in the sense that student learning outcomes depend to a lesser extent on the social context than was the case in the past. The United States is a good example. Overall, we can say that there hasn't been much change in the performance of American students. But you can see, relatively speaking, students from disadvantaged families have seen quite important improvements. You can say the same about Germany, about Mexico, about Chile, Turkey. That is about reading. You can do the same thing in other domains, and you can see a picture that's showing us that improvement is possible. Now, one of the things that we did for the first time is look at how have disparities evolved over successive cohorts. The blue bar shows you what we saw in 1995 among 10-year-old students. Basically, it's the longer the bar, the greater the dependence of learning success at age 10 on social background. You can see on the left side in Canada, there's not much of a relationship. There wasn't much of a relationship between social background and learning outcomes in 1995 among 10-year-olds. If you look to New Zealand or Korea, you could see the relationship was quite strong. And then those who were 10 years old in 1995, they were 15-year-olds in the year 2000. So we used the first PISA assessment to look at how closely social background was related then. And what you can see in most of the countries, actually the link between social background and the quality of learning outcomes had become stronger. That's a worry, because it shows us that our societies, our education systems have not been able generally to moderate social inequality, but social inequality have grown. Now, the 15-year-olds, 10 years later, we looked at them in the PIAC survey, actually to be precise in 2014-15, and that's the green dot. And we tested them again when they were in the labor force, in the workforce, and the general population. And you can see also there in some countries disparities tended to grow further. Compare, for example, Canada among 10-year-olds. Things look quite good. Social disparities were very limited. Students came into school in quite equal families. But then, as they were 15 and 25 to 29-year-olds, you could really see that the impact of social background became quite important. You compare that with Korea. You can say when students enter school in the beginning, 10 years, you can see an important relationship between social background and learning outcomes. But as students become older, that gap doesn't grow. So in a way, Korea is a good example of a country that has been able to contain the growth of dependency of success on social background. But generally, what this tells us is that we really need to start early building strong foundations. Once those kinds of social disparities have settled in around the age of 10, they are more likely to grow as students grow older. When you look at different cohorts on this, of course, these are not individual students who we follow, but we follow their respective cohorts. Let's add to this the aspect of social emotional well-being, sense of belonging at school, student self-efficacy, and career expectations. Studied those as well, and the first thing that we actually see is that it's not only that learning outcomes depend on social background, but also students' sense of control, their growth mindset, their capacity or their belief that they can overcome difficulties. Also, that depends on socio-economic background. In other words, in most countries, students from disadvantaged backgrounds do not trust their abilities. They, see their education sorting themselves, but they do not see that they can that their investment in learning is going to make a difference for their lives. Now, what's encouraging is that on the right side, you see a number of countries where this actually improved between 2006 and 2015. Basically, the gap, the index difference between socioeconomically advantaged and disadvantaged groups of students in terms of their self-efficacy has shrunk in some countries quite significantly, telling us that those things, again, not written in stone, that students' beliefs are also something that can evolve over time, and the relationship with social background can evolve over time. Why is this important? Because students' sense of control over their learning, their belief that effort is going to make a difference, that they can overcome difficulties even if they don't know the answer right now, that in itself is a very powerful predictor for the success in learning. The big question, of course, is, can we overcome those kinds of obstacles? Are there students who succeed despite coming from a disadvantaged context? We looked at this in two ways. We study academic resilience. Do students from disadvantaged backgrounds still succeed, do well on the PISA test? And we looked at social emotional resilience. To what extent do field students who come from disadvantaged background a high sense of belonging and so on? Let's start with the academic part first. There are three standards that we have set. First of all is an international standard of resilience, where we basically look at disadvantaged students who come out in the top quarter of performance in science among all of the students that participated in PISA, after we take into account the social background. Then we look at to what extent do students succeed by national standards. Basically, to what extent do disadvantaged students come out in the top quarter of performance in their own country? In a way, that's the most compelling measure. To what extent do systems succeed to give students from disadvantaged the kind of education that students from the privileged backgrounds get? And we also look at what we call core skills resilience. To what extent do disadvantaged students do well in absolute terms? And we measure this by their performance at level 3 on the PISA assessment. So let's have a look at some of the results here. And you can see all 3 measures coming out here. The green dot shows you about international resilience. Now that's basically to what extent the share of disadvantaged students who achieve at least good levels on the PISA assessment. And the most amazing country is basically Vietnam here. Now you are a disadvantaged student, you come from a disadvantaged background, but over 70% of those students do still do well on the PISA assessment. Whereas you can see on the left side, some of the countries have virtually no students that actually do well on the international standard. When you look at national resilience, there's much less variation across countries. Basically, getting students to succeed relative to your top performing students when they come out of disadvantage, something much harder to achieve. What we do know is when you look at the blue dot, what makes students nationally resilient has a lot to do with equity and educational opportunity. What you can see on this chart is basically that variation in science performance explained by socio-economic status and the dependency of success in learning outcomes on social background is very closely related to the share of nationally resilient students. It's also intuitive, where we provide very equitable learning opportunities to students, we expect many from disadvantage to be very successful. And that's exactly what this kind of graph somehow shows you. Now, the most interesting question, of course, is what are some of the predictors of academic resilience? And I look here at national resilience because, again, in a way, for policy purposes, that's probably the most interesting aspect to look at. To what extent are we overcoming the barriers in each of our countries? The first thing that we see is that early childhood education and care, pre-primary education, is an important predictor. Students who had attended at the typical age of early childhood education versus those who did not had a higher chance of being resilient. That's about 2 percentage points. Boys were more resilient than girls in general, in science, I should say, because boys perform better on science than girls. It would have been very different if we looked at this in reading. The school location. Basically, a city school has an advantage over a rural school. Students growing up in city schools basically have a higher likelihood to overcome social disadvantage, perhaps because the city environment offers more opportunities, more diverse opportunities, but there may be other factors. Not having an immigrant background is an advantage. That's what you would expect. Those are factors that are all very hard to change and control. Basically, the pre-primary education is something we can do something about, but the gender, school location, immigrant background, those are fairly immutable. The disciplinary climate, there we get directly to the school, and you can see actually being basically in the top quarter of disciplinary climate. Here we look at the time that is lost in noise and disorder, the quality of student-teacher relationship, those factors that shape the quality of learning, the orderly climate in learning, and that basically has already a big influence on resilience. Now, where there is an orderly climate for learning, a productive kind of learning environment, you can see a much greater share of students overcome social disadvantage. Program orientation, that may be a selection effect. We can see that students opting for general versus vocational programs tend to be more resilient. Motivation to achieve, where students felt that drive, that level of motivation to do well, actually we could see they were more likely to overcome social disadvantage. Not having repeated a school year is an important driver. Now, those students who basically had repeated the school year were much less likely to be resilient. And last but not least, the elephant in the room is the socioeconomic profile of the school. It's not your own social background, but the social background of the peers around you in the school. That's what we call the socioeconomic profile of schools. When you actually study the latter, I'm going to come back to this. That is one of the things where public policy has a very important role to play. Now, that was about academic resilience. Let's briefly touch on social emotional resilience. I'm just going to focus on a couple of aspects. We looked at students who feel satisfied with their life, who feel socially integrated at school, felt a high sense of belonging at school, and also don't suffer much from anxiety for tests. Now, those three factors basically we combined in an index of social emotional resilience when we looked at the students from the disadvantaged backgrounds coming out well on those measures. And what we can see basically when you look at the top pane here, this varies as much across countries as in academic terms. You can see, for example, in the Netherlands, you come from a disadvantaged background, and despite the fact that the Netherlands is a country where there's a lot of testing in school, actually students don't feel particularly worried, the disadvantaged students. If you look to Colombia or the Dominican Republic or Brazil, actually the share of students who are not suffering from test anxiety is very low. So anxiety is a really important problem. Social integration varies across countries for those who come from disadvantaged, and then also life satisfaction. And when you summarize them in an index of social and emotional resilience, you can basically see that students in the Netherlands, in Switzerland, in Finland, Croatia, Germany, Latvia, and so on, they can be considered resilient, social emotional resilient. So they come from a disadvantaged backgrounds, but they still feel happy with their lives and not suffering from test anxiety, and they feel socially integrated in school. Whereas on the left side of the chart, you can see that resilience is not so well developed. Now, why is this important? Because those are very important dimensions that shape what we do in our lives and how our attitudes to learning relate. Now, if we basically don't feel socially integrated in school, then many other factors are impeded as well. What we also know is that resilient students are more likely, academically resilient students are more likely to be also socially and emotionally resilient. It's not true in all countries. On the left side, you can see some countries where that relationship is not pronounced, but on the right side, you see basically being academically resilient makes you more likely to also be socially and emotionally resilient, or vice versa. That relationship goes, of course, in both ways. I mentioned already that the social profile of schools is a big driver of outcomes. And here I study this in a little bit more detail. First of all, what we see is that across countries, almost half of the disadvantaged students also go to a school that has many other disadvantaged students. And what we know is that the disadvantage of the school is even more powerful than the individual disadvantage. You've seen that on the preceding charts. So basically, those students get penalized twice. They come from a poor family, and they're also entering a school in which the conditions really are difficult. But the level of concentration vary across countries hugely. In a country like Peru, which is a relatively poor country, obviously most schools are disadvantaged. So most students also end up in disadvantaged schools. In a country like Finland, on the left side, the country has been quite good in distributing disadvantaged students quite well, but also overall levels of disadvantage are not that high. So there are several factors entering into this level of concentration. The sources of the concentration of difference can also be very different. It could be overall poverty, as I already mentioned. It could be that an education system is highly stratified, where we track and stream students into different programs. Often our aspiration is to stream by academic standards, but we typically end up streaming by socioeconomic background. And that's what can be one of those kinds of sources. So there could be features, or it could be residential segregation, where you live in a poor community and the school is sort of located in that community and there are no other options and choices available, then that background is affecting your own education. So different drivers of the variation that you can see, level of concentration. It's important to keep this in mind when we study actually the difference this is going to make. Let me show you this on the following chart. Take a disadvantaged student. If that student goes to an also disadvantaged school, that student performs on average across countries below 440 points, very poorly. If the disadvantaged student goes to a privileged school, you can see there's performance over around 510 points. That's already a good result by OECD standards, no? Well, around above the OECD average. Of course, this is not about moving individual schools across the system. These are different types of students that end up in different schools. It could, for example, be that on the right side, you see students which had very ambitious parents. They came from disadvantaged, but they took really good care that their child ends up in a privileged school. There could be many things going on. But what you do see is that the type of school, the social composition of schools is very strongly related to the performance of students from similar social backgrounds. Disadvantaged students in disadvantaged schools do a lot less well than disadvantaged schools and privileged schools. And it works but what's also interesting, you see that overall gradient, but you look at countries like Finland, like Iceland, like Macau, like Norway, like Poland, where disadvantaged students perform almost equally well in advantaged and disadvantaged schools. So where it doesn't matter whether you enroll your child in a wealthy neighborhood or poorer neighborhood, the school is providing an environment that helps all children to achieve really quite good learning outcomes. That's possible. When you do the same thing for average students or privileged students, the pattern is very different, very similar, no? And there's no surprise in this, because one of the things that we see in the report is that disadvantage in the school in socio-economic terms typically goes along with disadvantage in terms of the quality of resources of schools. Disadvantaged schools typically have fewer qualified teachers. They have a greater shortage of material resources. So in a way, it wouldn't surprise you that those kinds of differences in conditions translate into better or worse outcomes across all social groups. Now, how does this work across countries? Basically, what you can see on the right side, you look at Japan, you look at France, the Netherlands, is basically if you get into an advantaged school, that is a huge advantage for yourself. Basically, the way in which the social composition of school amplifies individual social background is very large in countries like Japan, France, Netherlands, Slovenia, and so on. And it's very small in Iceland, Finland, Norway, and Poland. I already made that point, or Moldova, or Sweden. In those countries, basically, it doesn't matter so much where you enroll your student. I mean, the kind of social environment of school, students have a similar rate of success across the system, whereas on the right side, it really matters. So that varies, that extent to which the socioeconomic profile of schools influences learning outcomes is hugely different across countries. We also see that academic inclusion is quite closely related to social inclusion. The relationship is not perfect. You see some countries that do better in terms of social inclusion than they do in terms of academic inclusion, but overall, if your system is highly stratified, highly selective, lots of different programs, you are more likely also to end up with an academically less inclusive school system. That's quite important for public policy as well. Now, that was about disadvantage and its impact on outcomes early in the lives of people. One of the things that we have asked ourselves is also, how is this going to play out later in the lives of people? And it's the first time that we were able to look at longitudinal data in terms of how disadvantage plays out. Here's some interesting data from Denmark. Basically, what you can see here is that the learning outcomes that students had at age 15, when we followed them over time and retested them at the age of 26, we got almost the same story. In mathematics, 70% of the variance at age 26 was explained by what we had already seen at age 15. And then years of schooling added a little bit more, and then just 17% that we couldn't explain. You can look at this in two ways. On the one hand, it shows you actually on the positive side, what you do in school really matters. In mathematics, it's a very powerful predictor for your skills later on. At the same time, it also shows us that we're not making that much of a difference. Basically, students who have mastered the fundamentals in math are going to do well and build on their skills later on, whereas students who were left behind don't have many opportunities to catch up. It looks a little bit different in reading. Reading is something which happens in many parts in life. You can learn in context at work and so on, whereas math is very much a school-bound subject. You don't learn mathematics sort of as much in home as you might learn reading. But even in reading, 56% of the performance variation at age 26 was already predicted by what we could see at age 15. Now, when you look at progression, the first thing that will not surprise you is that the performance of students on the PISA test was a very strong predictor for the rate of completion, university completion, that we observed at age 25. And that's true in every country for which we had data. Students from the top quarter on PISA were much more likely to complete the university than those students who had not done well in PISA. Right? In the case of Switzerland, for example, if you belong to the bottom quarter of student performance on the PISA test, your chance to complete university is almost zero. But there's more to this. When we actually looked at university completion for 25-year-olds, with or without tertiary educated parents, you can see in every country having a parent, at least one parent, who had a university degree made your likelihood to complete university much bigger. And now you can say, well, that's because better educated parents invest more in the education of the children, they do better on the PISA test, and that is what predicts their university completion, as I just shown you on the preceding chart. But in fact, we can control for that. Even after controlling for reading performance at age 15, you can see actually that parental education really matters. Look at the United States. Even after you control for the learning outcomes at age 15, at age 25, you can see that there is a gap of over 20 students with better education. That's something really important to keep in mind. We also see that the same thing when we look at having a skilled job at the age of 25. In every country, even after controlling for learning outcomes, you can see that your propensity to have a skilled job is actually better if you have well-educated parents. We looked at not just outcomes, we looked also at students' own dreams and expectations about their future. Have a look at this chart. Basically, what you could say is we ask students at age 15 what they wanted to do in their lives, what kind of occupation they would expect by the age of 30. And what you can see is career expectations at age 15 were associated with a much greater likelihood of being in skilled employment at the age of 25. Now, again, you can say, to what extent is that a factor of reading performance? But even after you control for this, the bars remain very long. Look at Denmark. Basically, having high expectations for yourself in terms of your career, even irrespective of your learning outcomes, is a very strong predictor for actually ending up with high level of skills and employment. So those things are really important. The peers around you, the expectations of your peers in the university, even after accounting for reading performance, are an important predictor for getting a university degree by age 25. So having students around you who have higher levels of ambitions actually is a good predictor for yourself, actually completing higher levels of education qualifications, even after controlling for learning outcomes. Students who invest greater effort and perseverance at the PISA test are more likely to complete university by the age of 25 as well. So investing effort. And the reason why I'm highlighting those features is because some of them we can influence directly. Their career expectations, particularly disadvantaged students, often they only know the job of the father or their mother or their families. But what we can do is ensuring that those students do have a broader world view, that they encounter professions from different ranges and so on, so that they can develop high levels of expectations. And that seems to make a difference. And effort and persistence, perseverance are also important ingredients of a good instructional environment. You can see even net of parents' education and PISA performance, that's a very, very powerful predictor. So let me conclude. We see that it's very important to support disadvantaged children and young adults in their education system, diagnosing early on when students fall behind and intervening in inverse in proportion to success. It's not about tracking grade repetition, putting the blame and problem on students. It's about really redoubling our efforts so that all students have high expectations and do well. Early learning, you could see that as an important predictor, and it's again something that public policy can do, not just providing access to early learning, but ensuring that there is high quality in those environments, that they are not just about taking care of children, but really developing their cognitive, social, and emotional well-being. Setting ambitious goals and monitor the progress of disadvantaged students is important. Developing teachers' capacity to identify where students need additional help and then manage their diversity of learning styles, preferences, needs in the classroom. Aligning resources with needs, attracting the most talented teachers into the most challenging classrooms, ensuring that students in the most disadvantaged areas have all access to excellent teaching and learning is very important. The level of concentration of disadvantage is clearly an issue in a number of countries. And last but not least, reaching out to parents, ensuring that where social disadvantage is mediated through families, that parents are on board and understand the value of the education. Those are a few conclusions that we draw on the report. Once again, it's the first time that we were able to build a comprehensive pictures of how inequality develops in an education system and what the consequences are. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Andreas. We have a few questions from participants. The first one is, please can you talk a little bit more about countries where learning outcomes depend less on background than in the past? For example, Germany or the US or any other countries?
Yeah, one of the things that we see, Germany is an interesting case. You can still say it's an inequitable country in the sense that there is a quite close dependency of learning outcomes on social background, at least as close as on average across countries. What's interesting in Germany is that Germany has been able to change that relationship. If you look at that relationship in the past, it was much stronger in the early PISA assessments than it is today. So I think it's an example showing us that we can actually change those dynamics and change those kinds of relationships. The countries that are most impressive are the ones like some of the Nordic countries in Europe, or also East Asian countries, where actually that relationship between learning outcomes and social background is almost diminished. Those countries often redouble their effort to link resources with needs. You could see in Finland, it does not matter whether you enroll your child in a privileged or disadvantaged school, because in that disadvantaged school, students will find an environment where teachers can support them well, identify them. Finland devotes 30% of instruction time outside the classroom to students, developing a lot of kind of facilities and tools to engage with student learning needs. You can see some of those education systems being very good to pair high and low performing schools. So there are many examples we can take away from this report that addressing disadvantage is really possible.
Sorry, we have another question. The data show that school profile has a larger effect than individual indicators. So it seems that we need to pay more attention to school effects. What would you advise? What would be the most important school composition factors to be considered?
Yeah, the observation is correct. The socio-economic context of schools is much more closely related to learning outcomes than the individual background from which students come. In part, that is because what we see in disadvantaged schools, it's often harder to attract talented teachers, is often harder to provide high quality material resources. Even the infrastructure is often, sometimes even the financial resources are more limited, where school funding, for example, depends on the community in which you go to school. And those are all variables that public policy can address. Now, we can do more to build career structures that attract high talented teachers into disadvantaged schools. We can differentiate the resources. Now, some countries have done it. I'm in London today. They have introduced a pupil premium where actually disadvantaged schools get more resources to address their challenging circumstances. So there's a lot that public policy can do to mediate that relationship, but it remains a formidable challenge. And ultimately, the more socially diverse we can make schools, the less prone are students to encounter those kinds of difficulties. But that's a difficult where there is residential segregation, where there is other forms of stratification. It's difficult to change the composition of schools, but what we can do better is to mediate the effects.
Thank you. We have another question. You showed 3 indicators on resilience. Can you elaborate further how countries can use these 3 different indicators to monitor their success in performance and equity?
Yeah, I'm not sure what the question refers to. Is it the 3 indicators of social and emotional resilience? Then I think the sense of belonging of students is certainly something that relates to the features of the school, the disciplinary climate, the student-teacher relationships. All those are amenable to public policy. Anxiety with tests. Actually, what's very interesting from PISA is that we find no relationship between anxiety and the prevalence of tests. So we don't reduce anxiety by having fewer tests or less ambitious tests. What we do see is that test anxiety is largely driven by the perceived level of teacher support that students have. So we can be very demanding on students. The question is more, do students receive the support from their teachers to meet those high demands? And life satisfaction is perhaps less obviously linked to the environment of schools. So that's probably a function of many other things.
Thank you. Have another question. What is the single most important thing a country can do to diminish inequality in education? If there is
That's a hard question to answer, because you could really see that the conditions across countries vary hugely. But I would still think that aligning the quality of resources with needs, ensuring that we attract the most talented teachers in the most challenging context, to make sure that every student benefits from excellent learning, to this alignment of resources of needs, probably not the easiest, but the single most important prerequisite for achieving more equitable outcomes.
Thank you. Have another question. The longitudinal results are very interesting. Are these data available for any other countries than those presented, the 5 presented? If not, what prevents countries?
Yeah. There are other countries with longitudinal studies, but we were particularly interested in those that actually used PISA as a starting point so that we could see what the consequences of this are. And these are the only ones for which we have those kinds of data. It's a formidable challenge to collect longitudinal data because you need to track students in this quite mobile population and so on. So it is quite demanding in terms of resources. So we have only a limited range of countries. Nevertheless, what you can see actually is that the patterns that we observed around those very different countries are actually quite similar, which suggests that we can probably make broader inferences that go beyond those individual countries.
Thank you. We have one more question. Can equity in education solve other social problems?
Well, equity in education is the starting point. We can deal with social inequality in terms of or social lack of social mobility by addressing some of its consequences. Redistribution is an obvious way. I mean, we can give poorer families, poorer people additional resources. But it's so much smarter to deal with the sources of inequality, and education is the key source of inequality. And this is an achievable goal. In a way, we can give every student the same chances. And it really matters. If you come from a wealthy family, you're going to find many ways to success in life. You know, there are, even if you don't get a great school, probably you still have many ways to succeed in life. If you come from a poor family, you really only got one single card to play, one single chance, and that is a good school. If you miss that boat, as you could see in these data here, you're unlikely to get a second chance. In fact, the odds are going to be stacked up against you as you grow older. So providing more equitable education is certainly our most powerful bet to create a level playing field that then is a platform for greater social mobility. But I wonder, my colleague Daniel Salinas, who's on this as well, he's actually the mastermind of these analysis. He may have additional reflections on this question.
Thank you, Andreas. Yeah, I have a few points I would like to underscore about some of the questions that have been raised. One of them is somebody asked about how to use the indicators on resilience to monitor progress among disadvantaged students. And I think that actually is a very good question because, for example, when we look at national resilience, what we see is that OECD countries, the share of nationally resilient students is between 7 and 14%. If countries were to set ambitious goals in terms of progress for the disadvantaged students, I think it would make sense to raise that bar to perhaps thinking about 20% of or more of students in a reasonable time frame. I think also different countries, as we showed, have very different starting points. So when it comes to core skills resilience, for example, top performing countries have today about 25% of disadvantaged students who are core skills resilient. I think that can certainly be raised to a much higher percentage. So these indicators could be used by countries to set their own goals according to their starting points. Also, about equity solving other kinds of problems. Yes, in this report, well, we make particularly the link between equity in education and social mobility in the context of societies where income inequality has been increasing in recent years. And a first finding that we look, especially in the longitudinal analysis, is that more educated parents are more like students with more educated parents are more likely to complete tertiary education or skilled job, which from the point of view of social mobility is not good. But when disadvantaged students perform well at age 15, the relationship between socioeconomic origins and destination weakens significantly, meaning that the overall level of social mobility improves. So that really is a strong signal that if we support the performance of disadvantaged students early on in the process, we can not only benefit those students individually to move up, but the overall levels of equal opportunity in society would improve.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Andreas, did you want to add anything?
No, not for my part.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for your interest in this topic and in the OECD's work on education in general. You can find the publication that was released today on OECD iLibrary under the name Equity in Education, Breaking Down Barriers to Social Mobility. This webinar has been recorded and it will be available on our YouTube page, Edu Skills OECD. Thank you again for joining us. Goodbye.
Thanks, Rebecca.